Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today is a solo episode, and I have a deep dive into carbohydrates that I want to go over. And this is a pivot that I wanted to go for my episode this week. But I think it's good timing. There was a recent paper dropped on carbohydrates, and I want to go over it because I'm sure this is going to start to make the rounds. And I just want to kind of refresh on my thoughts on carbohydrate intake in general, because it has slightly changed over time. But first, before I go into that, if you're interested in a body recomp, what it is, how to do it, two different types of body recomp, the importance of focusing on body comp over weight, and the 10 things you need to do for body recomp, then my free checklist is for you, and the link to that is in the show notes. So make sure you go in and grab that. So with that out of the way, let's dive into today's topic. There's a recent, I think it's a narrative review, right? So basically they reviewed all the research on this topic. They didn't perform any new research or anything like that. And the title of the paper is, let me just put Carbohydrate Ingestion on exercise, metabolism, and physical performance. And so they looked at over 600 studies spanning 100 plus years. And again, they looked at carbohydrate intake. Now, this was going to be specifically in athletes, right? But I do think there's some things that we can take in general here. When we're talking to athletes and stuff, this is going to be people that are endurance type athletes, things like that, right? And so I'm just going to go through the authors, their 5 main takeaways from this paper. And then I'm going to go through my thoughts on carbohydrates. And then finally, I'm going to wrap up with, if you feel like you are someone who doesn't handle carbohydrates well, how we can potentially improve that there. So let's discuss this. So number one, his main takeaway was carb loading is misguided. And so basically the kind of recommendation is looking at, for some training, again, for long distance, again, playing sports, something like that, 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour. And so what that means is that can push some athletes over 1,000 carbohydrates a day, which is a lot of carbohydrates, right? Now, saying that, these energy needs for these athletes are going to be a lot higher, and potentially like that is one macronutrient that may have to get pushed up. And it says multiple meta-analysis in the report revealed that sports nutrition guidelines have overemphasized muscle glycogen and carbohydrate oxidation levels. So again, muscle glycogen being the storage form of carbohydrates within the muscle, and then carbohydrate oxidation is essentially using carbohydrates as fuel, right? What that is compared to, say, using fats. And it says, yet these metrics don't consistently align with performance. So what metric predicts performance? So number 2 point is primary performance driver is sustaining total brain energy. So we're looking at glucose, again, which is the energy that is basically readily available right there. Ketones and lactate, right? Not muscle glycogen or carb oxidation. In more than 160 sports performance studies, 88% showed that carb intake only benefits performance when blood glucose plummeted in the placebo group, triggering early fatigue in non-carb athletes due to brain energy deficit. Carbs maintain blood glucose and brain energy, and this outpredicted every other metric. Yet the brain's role has been sidelined in sports nutrition, ignoring evidence since the 1920s of its pivotal impact on performance. There, really what that's saying is there's multiple ways that blood glucose we ensure it doesn't plummet. Liver can help with that. It doesn't have to necessarily just be eating more carbohydrates. So there's other ways that you can maintain blood glucose through ketones, things like that, because the brain does need glucose for energy. And so that's where, again, if you are super low carbohydrate, something like ketones and stuff like that can help give that energy to the brain, right? So again, it's really saying that blood glucose plummeting is the big thing. So as long as you can maintain that, which again, it doesn't necessarily have to be high carbohydrate intake, that's going to be the primary performance driver. Number 3, high carbohydrate intake paradoxically accelerates glycogen breakdown and suppresses fat oxidation during exercise. This contradicts many of the sports nutrition marketing claims promoting high levels of carbohydrate supplementation, 60 to 120 grams an hour, to spare muscle glycogen, and evidence showing that higher fat oxidation correlates with better performance there. It's actually going to increase glycogen breakdown by having more carbohydrates and suppresses fat oxidation, which is super interesting there. Which again, I'm not necessarily saying I'm agreeing or disagreeing with this. I'm just saying these are the findings the main findings. This is the one that I do find to be fairly interesting, and this is going to go into sort of what I am going to talk about today. But number 4, health risks of sports nutrition guidelines. Emergent evidence has demonstrated that high carbohydrate intake can lead to prediabetes in a percentage of athletes. This analysis also reveals that current sport nutrition guidelines carbohydrate intake levels create a metabolic environment during exercise analogous to diabetes. So higher circulating insulin, lower fat oxidation, greater glycogen breakdown, and then a forced reliance on glucose as fuel, right? And so this is critical is we show that athletes are not immune to the metabolic problems driven by the food environment. So this is where I really do think that maybe very high amounts of carbohydrates for some people could potentially be problematic, right? So we would need to, I'm going to go over some things that we can do to maybe improve our body's ability to handle carbohydrates to where we don't run into these issues. But I do think that there's definitely a very individual amount of carbohydrates that's going to be beneficial for some people. And we can definitely go over that. And this is where these really high carbohydrate intakes could be problematic for people there. And then the final one was ketogenic athletes can bonk too. Bonk being like where you just hit a wall and you just can't perform anything else, but not if they fuel correctly. Contrary to claims, athletes on ketogenic diets can and do bonk, like on high carb diets, due to dropping blood glucose. The lack of strategic carbohydrate placement was a mistake many keto athletes made when trying to reach their peak performance. Small targeted brain fuel supplements, 10 grams an hour during exercise, boost peak performance without high carb loads. After 4-week adaptation, ketogenic performance equals high carb performance, but both high and low carb athletes benefit from 10 grams an hour carbs to maintain glucose brain energy for exercise greater than 60 minutes in duration, improving performance 22% there. So again, what that's saying is the main thing is maintaining that glucose and brain energy there, right? And again, that doesn't necessarily have to be done through just high amounts of carbohydrates. Interesting there that you could potentially adapt to this and whatnot, right? I just thought this was a very interesting, and now this is going to spark debates between high and low carbs, right? People are going to be like, no, you need high carbs. No, you don't. Like low carbs better. This shows it. And so I think it's just going to bring up a lot of debates around this topic. And so this is why I wanted to talk about it. I think these are interesting. Obviously, can we take every single narrative review is basically a review on the research that we have. And sometimes maybe some research isn't well done. So there's some problems with relying on this type of study, even though it is a summary of all the research there. But I do think it brings up some interesting things. So the lead author, Andrew Nick, he was actually on Dr. Mike T. Nelson's podcast, and he definitely brought up some interesting things. He is from my understanding, a type 1 diabetic. And so that obviously changes things for sure for them specifically, right? That would definitely be someone that's probably going to look into more low carb approaches and things like that there. But this kind of brings me into the next part of this podcast is something I wish more people understood is that carbs are the most individual macronutrient. What works for one person could be completely wrong for another, right? So protein is going to be fairly predictable in terms of what we need, right? We know from a body composition perspective, you're looking at around 1 gram per pound of body weight. Maybe we can go slightly lower, maybe we can go a little bit higher, but at the end of the day, like from person to person, like the research consistently shows that that's going to be the number, right? Like we can be very concrete of that's what we need from a protein perspective. Fat, in my opinion, is going to have minimum. Like we need to have at least 30 to 40 grams of fats per day. In the short term, if you go slightly under that, not overly concerning from my understanding of the research. But if we're consistently under that 30 to 40, I think we can start to run into some issues from overall health and hormonal issues as well too. But carbs, God, there's just a massive range in what is the right amount from one person to the next. And this is why I get so annoyed. I'm going to get annoyed with seeing these high versus low carb debates, right? People that are more high carb are going to now bash the study. People that are low carb are going to say, see, this is exactly why we don't need carbs. And I just think people are going to talk over each other, and people just get so caught up in what works for them or maybe what they practice, what they've learned. And they think they just get too caught up in this is how it needs to be done, when human physiology is going to have a range, and carbohydrate intake is the one that is going to be just very dependent from person to person, right? So I just want to go over a few things that will impact how many carbohydrates you can have here. And just keep in mind, there's such a range of carbohydrates too, right? Low carb doesn't have to mean zero carbs, right? It can mean, hey, lower carb can be 100 grams of carbs per day for some people, right? Body size is going to be important. Someone who is a larger body is going to they're going to have higher caloric needs. And so their carbohydrate intake, what's low for them is probably going to be slightly different from another person, right? 100 grams of carbs could be moderate, could be on the lower end, more moderate for some people, whereas 100 grams would be super low for some people, right? We can obviously 30 grams of carbs or less per day is low carb, right? I mean, that we can be, but there's that middle ground between 100 to 200 grams of carbs that it's like for some people it could be a little bit more moderate, it could be lower on there. So body size is going to be huge too, because that's obviously going to impact your caloric needs, which is certainly going to impact your carbohydrate needs there, right? So let's just keep in mind that high carb doesn't have to mean this like massive amount of carbohydrate intake, and there's everything in between. This is all on a spectrum here with that. So I think that's important to go over. So let's just talk about a few things that will impact your carbohydrate intake. First, we're looking at training load and activity. Someone who's training hard and moving a lot will generally do better with more carbs, and will generally they'll generally do better with more carbs, right? Someone that is not active, okay, your carbohydrate needs are going to go down. Now, obviously in this paper, they made the case that, hey, even if you have high activity, you don't need, like you can potentially get away with less carbs. And so I think that was something that maybe a few years ago I would have said no to, but I'm definitely open more to that now, just knowing a little bit more about metabolism and metabolic flexibility and things like that. And so I think also with these things, we have to take it's not just, hey, if you have a high training load and high activity, you automatically need high carbohydrates. I think there's other things that we need to take into consideration with this. So I put body fat percentage in my Instagram post, but I think a better way to look at it is body composition. I think someone that has higher body fat and less muscle will do better with lower to moderate carbs. And I think someone that is leaner with higher amounts of muscle, they'll usually tolerate and perform better with higher carbs. So I think that body composition is going to be important in that, right? So again, you get someone that's on the leaner side, they have a lot of muscle, they train a lot, high activity levels, they're generally going to do better with a higher carbohydrate intake in most cases. But as you'll see, there's other things that can impact this as well too. Individual preference and response. And so this is what I think is huge, right? This comes back to what they said here in this paper, where for some people, health risks of sports nutrition guidelines, this can lead to prediabetes for some people. And I think some people just genetically are going to be at a higher predisposition to developing diabetes just from a genetic standpoint. So this would be someone that, hey, maybe you need to potentially consume a little less carbohydrates, right? I think you could look at things like fasting glucose, fasting insulin, A1C, triglycerides to HDL ratio to see, where you're at. If you're maybe not on the greatest spot with some of those, and maybe you are super active and you have a lot of muscle and you train a lot, but those are not great, you might not be someone that I think needs a ton of carbohydrates per day. I think we can start to temper how much you have, right? So this is where some of these things do start to, it can't just be hey, you have a high training load, and so you automatically need high carbohydrate intake. I think we need to look into this a bit more here. There's an individual preference and response, right? So that's more of the response to carbohydrates. But some people do simply feel and perform better on higher carbs, and then some just prefer more fats, and both can work. So I think we also need to take in individual preference on this. Now, at the end of the day, we do need to look at how is somebody performing, what results are they seeing, and take that into consideration. If maybe you've at one point in time found out that, hey, lower carbohydrate intake helped you lose some weight, then you get super biased towards low carbohydrate intake. But we look, your body composition is not changing as we want, you're not performing well. We need to look into that more. Maybe you have a preference of slightly lower carbohydrates, but is that going to be best for you? So we need to look at these things here. And then again, like I said, the genetic difference is going to be huge, probably the biggest thing there. And so that leads me to the next one. What state of metabolic health are we in? The worse your metabolic health is, the less helpful very high carbohydrate intakes usually are. Again, people that are more active are generally going to have, in most cases, they're going to be fine from a metabolic health standpoint. But the genetic thing is going to play a role here. And so in this state, most people outside of the fitness industry are in poor metabolic health. So probably developing a lower carb intake is going to be better for the general population there. Now, again, calories do matter. We obviously need to take that into consideration when we look at improving metabolic health. Getting into a deficit and getting you to lose body fat is going to help with metabolic health, right? But again, there's the genetic aspect of it. So, what that is, you can lose weight on a higher carb intake, but how you feel and looking at your metabolic health are all going to be things that we're going to take into consideration to help you get there. Because again, if we were machines and we were able to be like, hey, you can have a high carbohydrate intake, but you're going to stick to this calorie amount for the entire time frame of your deficit, I think that again, it wouldn't matter. You could do a higher carb, you could do a lower carb. But when we actually get into how does somebody feel, how tough is it to sustain the deficit, that's where we may need to alter our carbohydrate intake. And someone that has poor metabolic health and they don't respond well to carbohydrates, a high carb intake could make a calorie deficit tougher to stick to there. So we would just have to look into that, right? So those are important. Next things we're looking at is what phase of nutrition you're in, right? Fat loss phases are usually going to mean slightly lower carb intakes to create a deficit, right? We have a certain amount of calories, they're going to have to drop from somewhere, right? So we need to look into that. Whereas building phases usually are going to mean higher carbs to support higher calories in training. So the phase of nutrition we're in is ultimately going to matter. Now, someone that's in poor metabolic health, their body fat percentage is on the higher end, we're probably not pushing calories as much. We're probably decreasing those a little bit, at least at maintenance. So that's obviously going to impact how high your carbohydrate intake gets. But at the same time, someone that maybe needs a higher caloric intake to support muscle growth, they're in good metabolic health, they're on the leaner side, we're going to need to push calories up in most situations, and they're probably going to be able to handle carbohydrates better. But if there's that genetic difference where maybe they don't handle carbs as well, we might have to look at increasing via fats a little bit more than say carbohydrates. But I am going to go over some things here at the end of this that will help your body handle and respond to carbs better there. I also think what your intake has looked like recently. So if you've always eaten very high carb, again, a lower carb phase, whether that be through a fat loss phase or some lower carb days, can be beneficial, or like a couple fasted training sessions, right? And vice versa. If you've always eaten high fat, low carbohydrate, again, I think on the opposite end, we're not very good at tapping into carb oxidation. So I think I think it's good to be able to do both. So I think if you're someone who's always been super low carb, I think having some higher carb days or a short high carb phase could be super beneficial, right? This isn't just hey, you need to go low carb. But if you've always eaten high carb, then I think a lower carb phase, whether that's through a fat loss phase or you just having some lower carb days in like your maintenance phase, I think can be beneficial to help with your metabolic health and to keep body composition in a good spot. So those are things that are going to impact where we're at in terms of carbohydrate intake there. I don't think I missed any other ones on this. So obviously I did an Insta post on this last Friday talking about this. So there's obviously some things I missed. It's really hard to get everything in that you want in just an Instagram post. It's something that people will actually read. So that's why I love the podcast, because I can really dive into this a bit more on here. So I think those are really the main things, right? I think the point I wasn't really able to make as well on my Instagram post is that these are all going to be, it's not just one factor, right? We have to look at all these factors in the person there, right? Like I said, just because you have a high training load and activity doesn't mean that we automatically need high carbohydrate intake. I think we need to look at the rest of these things and see where we're at there to determine our carbohydrate intake. But so yeah, one thing though I have definitely changed my mind on over the years is lifters needing massive amounts of carbs, right? If you're 30 plus, you enjoy training, but you lift 3 to 6 times a week, nothing crazy. You do some cardio and you stay moderately active. I don't think you need huge carb intakes all the time, right? This is the thing that I've changed my mind on the most. My building phase in the past, when I pushed my calorie surplus, it was like massive amounts of carbohydrates. And it's like looking back, it's okay. I was not moving it like a ton because I wanted to make sure I wanted to make sure that I wasn't losing muscle in any way. So I had a really high carb intake on very moderate levels. And again, there's a thought like, oh, hey, you have carbs before training, it's going to help with performance. But it's like for a weightlifting session, we really don't need massive amounts of carbohydrates to get through our training. It can help. We don't want to be super low carb, and we don't want to be like, I do think carbohydrates can help with performance, but I also don't think we need to stress massive amounts of carbohydrate intake for people that just do this right now. Once we get into, like I said, endurance training, you're an athlete for a sport, okay, we probably need to look at increasing our carbohydrate intake. But we always have to look at, hey, what are these other factors going on specifically for you? But if you feel like you need to down a ton of carbs just to get through a basic lifting session, to me, that's a sign that something else needs to work. You need some carb quality, like you need to improve your carb quality. You need to work on metabolic flexibility, maybe some lower carb days or fasted cardio sessions. You need to look at your recovery, sleep, stress, your metabolic health, and just your overall fueling consistency, right? So if that's you and you feel like you need to, if you don't have food right before you work out, or you have to have carbs very regularly, otherwise you feel this way, I think there's something that we need to potentially look at there. And again, carbs are not bad. They're great for performance, but does everyone need massive amounts? Maybe not. It's individual. And then the one last thing I want to go over before I dive into how we can improve our response to carbohydrates is carb source matters, right? If most of your carbs are coming from ultra processed foods, carbs aren't the problem. It's really the diet quality, right? Like we need to work on that if that's the case. All right. So what I want to go over now is, so we've summed up that paper. I looked at, okay, what's going to impact our carb needs? And now what I want to go over is, okay, if you feel like you don't handle carbs, every time you eat carbs, you blow up, you retain a bunch of water, or you just have trouble losing body fat, I don't think it's that carbs are the problem. It's that how our body handles them is not good. And so we need to work on that. So what are some things we can do to help improve that? You may be someone that, we go back to the preference thing, you've always been on the lower end of carbs because, again, you just feel better, or you lost body fat at one point. So it's like now you've adopted that way of eating. And so this is who this is for. But if you're also someone who's always been high carbohydrate intake, and maybe you're deeper into a building phase, or your body composition has slowly gone downhill over time, even though you were doing the things that you were doing 2 years ago, I think we want to look into this. And again, it's the same thing as, you don't have to necessarily do all of these, but see what you need the most help with and then go from there. With that, it's hard to diagnose everything. I don't want to say this is in any particular order either. I think these are all important. And again, it depends on what you need specifically. So the first thing we can do to help get our body to handle carbohydrates better is going to be build muscle, right? So this would be someone who maybe has never focused on adding muscle, or you've always been weight loss focused. We probably need to spend some time building muscle. Muscle is your body's biggest glucose sink. So more muscle equals more places to put carbs. And you don't need to be super jacked to benefit either, right? But you do need to intentionally build some muscle. It takes effort, and most people have way less muscle than they think. Even if fat loss is your goal, building muscle can support that. In fact, one study showed that increasing muscle mass led to a reduction in body fat over. So if carbs aren't sitting well with you, muscle might be the missing piece that you need. And no, you don't need to gain a bunch of weight to build muscle there. So again, just making sure we build some muscle can be super important. I think of these to go back to the paper that I discussed earlier, these people that are endurance athletes, while they're on the leaner side, they may not, because of the high amounts of having too much muscle, could be detrimental to their performance in these long distance events. Maybe they don't have enough muscle, and that's part of the reason why some of these people are predisposed to pre-diabetes, right? Or maybe they just have a lot of stress. Their recovery is poor there. So again, I still think there's some things that we can do to improve this there. Post-meal movements, a short walk or some light movement after meals can significantly improve blood sugar management. This can also help with digestion, and it gets you more movement in your day, right? So a meal plus a walk is better blood sugar control. That's another thing that we can do to help handle carbohydrates better, is get some paired around movement if possible, especially in that post kind of meal time frame there. Build your cardiovascular system, add some conditioning, minimum of 2 times per week. Start with low to medium intensity. This doesn't mean you need to go and just hammer out HIIT sessions, because that can put your body in can place higher stress load on your body. You can be under recovered, and that is going to impact your body's ability to handle carbohydrates there. Even though carbs can help with recovery, if we're super under recovered and we're just having massive amounts of carbs, I definitely think that can impact things there. So we want to build our cardiovascular system. That's going to help our body handle carbohydrates better. Lower resting heart rate and improve HRV. This really talks about the thought with this is more stress management things, right? Improving your recovery this is going to help lower your insulin sensitivity. This is going to help improve your insulin sensitivity. So you have higher insulin sensitivity, whereas low HRV and high resting heart rate is linked to lower insulin sensitivity. This means moderating your training intensity and volume, plus focusing on lowering stress load on your body and dialing in overall recovery is going to be super helpful here in this process there. So I would also say dial in your circadian rhythm. That's definitely going to help with your carbohydrate metabolism. Dialing that in, so sleep and circadian rhythm, more sunlight earlier in the day, limiting caffeine intake too late in the day, consistent sleep and wake time, avoiding blue light, ton of light exposure later at night, avoiding really massive meals right before bed, timing more of your carbohydrate intake to earlier in the day versus massive amounts of carbs right before bed. So improving your circadian rhythm is definitely going to help your body's ability to handle carbohydrates better there, right? So again, this could be a thing. Hey, these athletes that had high carbohydrate intake and they led to pre-diabetes. Again, maybe their recovery was not great. Their circadian rhythm was out of whack. There's a high chance that was going on with these people. Again, I don't know if they looked into that, but I'm just thinking out loud here of what could potentially be happening with that. So again, circadian rhythm is going to be super helpful. Like I say, so I did put that in my list. So dial in your circadian rhythm and deep sleep. So get morning sunlight, limit blue light at night, and stick to a consistent sleep and wake schedule. Time your carbs smarter. So eat more carbs around workouts and earlier in the day. Your body's less efficient at processing carbs late at night. Unless you're very lean dieting, then carbs may help with sleep recovery. But we need to look into that. But timing your carbs smarter is definitely going to be helpful here. Potentially including one higher intensity interval 1 time per week. So hard intervals can help improve glucose uptake and carb tolerance. If you're someone that just walks and you just do weight training, maybe adding in 1 day of higher intensity intervals can be helpful. And like I said, really improving your carb quality is going to be huge, right? So choose slower digesting fiber-rich carbs like potatoes, sweet potatoes, oats, lentils, beans, berries, and fruit, and cut back on ultra-processed stuff where you can. That is probably the biggest concern with these really high carbohydrate intakes is you can only have so many potatoes, right? To where you're just not going to be able to get in that many carbohydrates through just potatoes. So that's probably where the biggest issue is with these high carbohydrate intakes for these athletes is a lot of them have to be more processed type carbohydrates. You're looking at gels, things like that, things that are easier to digest because we can't just have veggies and like I said, potatoes. That's just like from a GI standpoint, you're not going to be able to do a ton of activity on that. So that's probably another thing that's going on here as to why that could lead to those issues for these athletes on there. But if we're improving our carb quality, we probably can handle carbohydrates a lot better there. The other thing I wanted to bring up too is if you are someone, sorry, completely missed the whole section. So 2 things, get leaner. We don't need to be shredded, but getting to a leaner body fat will help. Probably one of the risks here of these endurance athletes is their muscles probably low, but they're also probably very lean. And being very lean is probably not going to be great either in terms like your body's, when we look at stress out on the body, the stress out on the body is probably fairly high there. So super high carbohydrate intake is probably going to become problematic for this person. But you don't need to get shredded, but getting to a leaner body fat percentage will help. So if you feel like you're having problems with carbohydrates, we probably need to spend some time lowering your body fat percentage, which means that you're probably going to have a period of time where you are slightly lower carbohydrate intake to get to that point. So we're looking at about 10 to 20% for men and about 20 to 30% for women there. And so, yes, that means lower carb intake for a bit to get there. And then, like I said earlier, spend some time in a lower carb, lower energy state every so often. You don't need to and shouldn't be low carb or in a deficit year round, but spending intentional time in a lower energy and or carb state can improve how your body uses fuel long term. So this is more so for the person that's always been higher carb. A lower carb intake for a period of time can help resensitize you to that. And then what I want to say is, if you're someone who is maybe you've been low carb and you feel like you don't respond well to carbohydrates, it's probably better to slowly titrate your carbohydrate intake up versus just going from 50 grams of carbs a day to now trying to eat 300 carbs a day, right? I would do 50, maybe do 100 to maybe 125 to 150, see how your body's responding and go from there. So like slowly titrate up there with that. Magnesium supplementation can also be helpful. So most people don't get enough magnesium and it can play a role in carb metabolism. This is a foundational supplement. In one study, magnesium supplementation improved fasting glucose, insulin levels, and markers of insulin sensitivity. And that's just one of the many benefits of magnesium supplementation. So a couple extra thoughts here that I want to wrap up with. The menstrual cycle can certainly impact how your body handles carbs. In the luteal phase, you may need to pay closer attention to these strategies that I discussed today. And eating carbs and gaining a pound or two from one day to the next doesn't mean you don't tolerate them. It's usually just water and glycogen there. Just keep that in mind. Just because you have carbs from one day to the next and your weight goes up doesn't mean that you don't handle carbohydrates well there. So cool. That sums up my episode on carbohydrates. So I hope this gave you some more insight into carbohydrates and what you need specifically. I think a lot of it is trial and error. And this is what I help clients figure out when they first come to me, right? It's, hey, where are we at? What is your blood work? What is your metabolic health? How do you respond to carbohydrate intake? What have you been doing? What type of training are we doing? These are all things that we're looking at there. And instead of just being like, yep, you need 200 grams of carbohydrates there. So let me know if you guys have any questions on this topic. You can follow me on Instagram, Jeff, HOEHN_. That's where I'm most active on social media. So if you have any questions, just reach out there. Again, this is exactly what I do inside my performance recount method, my one-on-one coaching program. And we work on these things and work with your body rather than against it, right? I think that's the biggest thing that most coaching programs do is they just, hey, this is what we need to do, and work against your body and not with it there. Make sure if you're interested in that, just reach out to me. And then lastly, if you found this podcast to be helpful in any way, if you could leave a rating and review, and that will help more people find it. Talk to you guys soon.